In the bustling corner of a quaint bookstore cafe, Meryl Streep sat quietly observing the gentle interactions between customers and staff, her presence disguised by simple attire and reading glasses, when her attention was drawn to Emma, a young woman with Down syndrome, who worked behind the counter with a smile that brightened the room. But the peaceful atmosphere shattered as a businessman in an expensive suit began berating Emma for taking too long with his order, his harsh words cutting through the air like knives, while other customers lowered their eyes, pretending not to notice the cruel spectacle unfolding before them. What no one realized was that the legendary actress wasn't just watching. She was about to step in and change everyone's perspective in a way they'd never forget. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from if you enjoy stories like this. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Pages and Brews was known throughout the small town of Millfield for its warm atmosphere, with the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the distinct aroma of new and vintage books. Soft jazz played in the background as customers sipped their drinks, some lost in novels, while others typed away on laptops. It was in this literary haven that Emma Thompson had found her first real job at the age of 24. Emma adjusted her apron, smoothing it down with careful hands. The small brass name tag pinned to her chest gleamed under the warm lighting of the cafe. First day on the register, she whispered to herself, a ritual of reassurance her mother had taught her. Each morning for the past 2 weeks, she'd repeated those words, marking her progress from shelving books to making simple drinks, and now to handling the register. Jane Martinez, the manager who had given Emma this chance when 5 other businesses had turned her away, watched from near the pastry display with quiet pride. "You've got this, Emma," she said with an encouraging nod before turning to help another employee with the morning delivery. Emma's path to this moment hadn't been easy. Flashbacks of job interviews cut short, of pitying smiles and empty promises to call you back haunted her still. Her mother had held her through tears of rejection, whispering that the right place would see her value. Pages and Brews had been that place, and Emma was determined to prove her mother right. Across the cafe, partially hidden behind a worn copy of The Year of Magical Thinking, Meryl Streep watched the young woman work. The actress had slipped into the cafe unnoticed, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Designer clothes replaced by comfortable jeans and a casual sweater. Millfield was a stop on her way to a location shoot, a chance to gather herself before the intensity of a new role. She hadn't expected to find such peace in this corner establishment, nor such an inspiration as the young woman whose enthusiasm seemed to infuse the very air. The morning rush ebbed and flowed, with Emma handling each customer with methodical care. She took her time, double-checking orders and carefully counting change. Some customers smiled patiently, seemingly touched by her determination. Others checked their watches but kept any impatience to themselves. Then Richard Harmon entered, bringing with him the sharp scent of expensive cologne and the air of someone unaccustomed to waiting. His tailored suit and leather briefcase marked him as out of place among the cafe's usual patrons. He tapped his Italian leather shoe while scanning the menu board, his expression growing increasingly rigid as he noted the line of 3 people ahead of him. "Is it always this slow?" he asked the young woman in front of him, not bothering to lower his voice. The woman glanced uncomfortably at Emma, then back at Richard. "It's worth the wait," she said softly, but Richard had already pulled out his phone, aggressively typing what looked like an email. From her corner table, Meryl lowered her book slightly, her attention caught by the shift in the cafe's atmosphere. Her eyes tracked the businessman, recognizing a character type she'd played against many times in her career, the person too important for the rhythms of ordinary life. When Richard finally reached the counter, Emma greeted him with the same bright smile she'd given every customer. "Good morning, welcome to Pages and Brews. What can I get for you today?" "Double espresso, no sugar to go," Richard said, not looking up from his phone. "And make it quick, please. Some of us have actual jobs to get to." The pointed comment hung in the air. Emma's smile faltered but didn't disappear. "1 double espresso coming up," she said, her voice slightly quieter as she carefully entered the order into the register. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, each button pressed with concentration. Richard sighed loudly, making a show of checking his watch. "Today would be nice," he muttered. Emma's hands began to tremble slightly, but she continued reciting the total with careful enunciation. As Richard handed over his credit card, she dropped it, the small plastic rectangle clattering to the counter. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing as she picked up the card. "Are you serious right now?" Richard's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby customers. "How hard is it to take a simple payment?" Jane looked up from across the cafe, concern crossing her features, but she was caught in conversation with a supplier, unable to break away immediately. Emma processed the payment, her breathing becoming more rapid. She turned to prepare the espresso, movements still methodical but now tinged with anxiety. The espresso machine steamed and hissed as she carefully positioned the cup. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, no longer trying to hide his irritation. "I've never seen such incompetence." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. A woman at a nearby table glanced up from her laptop, frowning slightly, but then returned to her screen. No one spoke. Meryl Streep set down her book entirely now, her eyes narrowing as she observed the scene unfolding. She saw Emma's shoulders hunch slightly, the young woman making herself smaller. In response to the verbal assault, she saw the other customers, their discomfort evident, but their silence complicit. As Emma finally turned to hand Richard his espresso, her hands shaking so badly that a few drops spilled onto the saucer, the businessman's patience evaporated entirely. "Look at this mess," he exclaimed, voice echoing through the now quiet cafe. "This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be working in customer service. You're clearly not capable." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she stood frozen, the cup and saucer extended in her trembling hands. The cafe fell completely silent, the background music suddenly seeming too cheerful for the cruelty unfolding, and that was when Meryl Streep stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with purpose. Her movement broke the terrible stillness as she took a deliberate step toward the counter, her expression calm, but her eyes alight with a quiet intensity that had commanded screens around the world for decades. Richard stood at the counter, oblivious to Meryl's approach as he continued berating Emma. "This isn't rocket science," he said, gesturing to the spilled espresso. "It's a simple cup of coffee. How can anyone mess that up?" Emma's face had gone pale, a stark contrast to her earlier flush of enthusiasm. The tears that had welled in her eyes now threatened to spill over as she tried to steady her breathing. The memory of her mother's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "When people are cruel, it says more about them than it does about you, sweetheart." But in this moment, those wise words provided little comfort. The cafe remained unnaturally quiet. A woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion, "Should someone say something?" Her friend merely shrugged, eyes downcast. Another customer pretended to be deeply engrossed in his laptop, though his fingers had stopped typing minutes ago. Jane finally noticed the commotion and began making her way across the cafe, but the morning crowd made her progress slow, forcing her to navigate between tables and apologize as she squeezed past seated customers. "I'm so sorry," Emma managed to say, her voice barely audible as she set down the espresso and reached for a napkin to clean the spill. Her hands trembled so severely that she knocked over a small container of wooden stir sticks, sending them clattering across the counter and onto the floor. The sound seemed to amplify Emma's humiliation. She froze, staring at the scattered sticks as if they represented every failure she'd ever experienced. Richard threw his hands up in exasperation. "Unbelievable, I don't have time for this." He turned to the customers behind him in line. "Is everyone seeing this? This is what happens when businesses hire people who aren't qualified just to look inclusive." The cruelty of his words hung in the air like a physical presence. One elderly man in line cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing. A college student shifted her weight from one foot to another, clutching her backpack strap tightly. For Emma, the cafe seemed to shrink around her, the lights suddenly too bright, the silence too loud. She was transported back to her high school cafeteria, standing with a tray of food as laughter erupted around her after she'd tripped. The same burning shame, the same desire to disappear, consumed her now. "I can help with another register," called one of Emma's co-workers, a young man, named Marco, who had been restocking supplies. His attempt to defuse the situation only seemed to fuel Richard's anger. "I don't want another register. I want competent service. Is that too much to ask?" Richard's voice had risen another notch. He leaned forward, invading Emma's space. "Maybe you should consider a job that doesn't involve dealing with people." Emma's breathing became shallow, her chest tight. The bright, hopeful morning that had started with such promise now felt like a nightmare she couldn't escape. 2 weeks of successful shifts, of customers who smiled at her earnest efforts, of Jane's proud encouragement. All of it seemed to crumble under Richard's withering assessment of her worth. Meryl, now halfway to the counter, observed every detail: Emma's downturned face, the rigid posture of Richard's shoulders, the collective discomfort of witnesses unwilling to intervene. As an actress who had spent decades studying human behavior, she recognized the dynamics at play: power, humiliation, and the bystander effect that allowed such cruelty to go unchallenged. Richard glanced at his watch again. "I've wasted 7 minutes of my morning already. 7 minutes!" He pointed accusingly at Emma. "Do you have any idea what my time is worth? I could bill a client hundreds of dollars in the time I've spent waiting for one simple coffee." A memory flashed through Emma's mind, her job coach explaining that she might work at a different pace than others, but that her thoroughness was an asset, not a liability. "Quality over speed," the coach had said with a warm smile. Emma had repeated those words during her interview with Jane, who had nodded approvingly. Now, though, Richard's words cut through that reassurance. Emma reached down to begin picking up the scattered stir sticks, crouching behind the counter, in what looked like both an attempt to clean up and to hide from the continued assault. "And now she's disappearing instead of fixing my order," Richard announced to the cafe at large. "This is exactly why—" "Excuse me?" Meryl's voice cut through his tirade, calm yet commanding. She had reached the counter now, standing just to Richard's left. Though she spoke quietly, there was something in her tone that demanded attention. "I believe the young woman is trying to clean up so she can better serve you." Richard turned, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. He gave Meryl a dismissive glance, not recognizing her beneath the simple attire and lack of stage makeup. "This doesn't concern you," he said curtly. "I think it concerns everyone in this cafe," Meryl replied, her eyes steady as they met his. "We're all witnessing someone being treated poorly while trying their best." Behind the counter, Emma slowly rose to her feet, a handful of stir sticks clutched in her trembling fingers. She looked at Meryl with a mixture of confusion and relief, not yet recognizing the famous actress, but grateful for any intervention in her moment of distress. Richard squared his shoulders, turning his full attention to Meryl. "Look, I'm a paying customer with places to be. I have a right to expect basic competence." "And she has a right to basic respect," Meryl countered, her voice maintaining its calm strength. "Regardless of how busy you are." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Richard's face as he studied Meryl more carefully. There was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the edge of his recognition. The confidence in her stance, the measured quality of her speech. She clearly wasn't intimidated by his expensive suit or assertive demeanor. The other customers in line had begun to whisper among themselves, a ripple of recognition spreading through the cafe. A young woman pulled out her phone, discreetly angling it to capture what was happening. Jane finally reached the counter, slightly breathless. "Is everything all right here? Emma, are you okay?" Before Emma could respond, Richard interjected, "No. Everything is not all right. I've been waiting an excessive amount of time for subpar service." He gestured toward Emma. "And now I'm being lectured by—" He paused, squinting slightly at Meryl, the first inkling of recognition dawning in his eyes. Meryl stepped closer to the counter, placing herself partially between Richard and Emma in a subtle but deliberate, protective gesture. "I think," she said, her famous voice becoming more recognizable with each word, "that we might all benefit from taking a deep breath and remembering why we're here. For good coffee, certainly, but also for a moment of humanity in our day." The cafe had gone completely silent again, but this time with a different quality to the stillness, anticipation rather than discomfort, as the customers collectively held their breath. Richard's eyes narrowed as recognition slowly dawned on his face. The confident stance, the measured voice, the unmistakable poise. He was standing face to face with Meryl Streep. His mouth opened slightly, words momentarily failing him as he recalibrated his approach. "Wait, he began, but Meryl didn't allow him to finish. "Right now, I'm just another customer who doesn't believe anyone deserves to be spoken to that way," she said, her voice carrying through the silent cafe. "Especially someone who's working so diligently." Emma remained behind the counter, confusion evident on her face as she registered the shift in atmosphere. All around the cafe, customers were now openly staring, some with phones discreetly recording. The ordinary morning had transformed into something extraordinary, though Emma didn't yet understand why. Richard straightened his tie, visibly struggling to maintain his composure in the face of this unexpected development. "My issue isn't personal," he said, his tone noticeably more controlled than moments before. "It's about efficiency and basic service standards." "Is it?" Meryl asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it sounded quite personal when you suggested she shouldn't be working here at all." A flush crept up Richard's neck. "That's not what It's exactly what you said," interrupted an elderly woman at a nearby table, finding her voice at last. "We all heard you." Emma's eyes darted between Meryl and Richard, her breathing still rapid, but her posture gradually shifting from hunched defensiveness to cautious attention. She placed the stir sticks she'd collected back in their container with meticulous care. Jane stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma is one of our most valued team members," she said firmly. "Our customers appreciate her attention to detail and genuine care." "I just need my coffee," Richard said, his earlier aggression deflating somewhat under the collective scrutiny. "I'm already late for a meeting." "And you'll get your coffee," Meryl replied. She turned to Emma with a warm smile. "Would you mind remaking the espresso? I'd be happy to wait." The simple act of being addressed directly with patience and respect seemed to steady Emma. She nodded, returning Meryl's smile with a tentative one of her own. "Yes, I can do that, thank you." As Emma carefully prepared a fresh espresso, Richard stood awkwardly at the counter, trapped by circumstance and the growing awareness that his behavior was being witnessed and judged by everyone present. Memory surfaced in Emma's mind as she worked, her mother helping her practice for her job interview, emphasizing that her worth wasn't tied to others' perceptions. "There will always be people who don't see your value, Emma," her mother had said, gently, "but that doesn't diminish your value one bit." Emma had repeated those words like a mantra during difficult moments, but they had never felt as real as they did now, with a famous actress standing up for her dignity in front of a cafe full of people. Meryl watched Emma work, noting the care with which she handled each step of the process. "You know," she said, addressing Richard, but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've always been fascinated by how we treat people in brief interactions. It says so much about who we are." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I may have been a bit harsh." "A bit?" Meryl echoed, her tone measured but pointed. "You publicly humiliated someone who was doing nothing but trying to serve you. And for what? To save a few minutes?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Several customers nodded in agreement, the collective mood of the cafe now firmly aligned against Richard's behavior. "In my 40 years in film," Meryl continued, "I've worked with all kinds of people, and I've found that those who take the time to be kind, especially when they're busy or stressed, those are the people who create environments where everyone can excel." Emma finished preparing the espresso with a steady hand. Her earlier trembling subsided. She placed it carefully on the counter in front of Richard. "Your double espresso, sir," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Richard reached for his wallet. "How much do I—" "It's on the house," Jane interjected. "But there is something you could give us instead of payment." Richard looked up, wary. "What's that?" "A moment of reflection," Jane said, "about how you might have handled this differently." The cafe remained silent as Richard stood frozen, espresso in hand, faced with an unexpected moral reckoning in what should have been a routine coffee stop. Several customers had abandoned any pretense of not watching, their attention fully captured by the unfolding drama. Emma, sensing the tension, spoke up with surprising clarity. "It's okay to have a bad day," she said, meeting Richard's eyes directly for the first time. "Everyone does sometimes. My mom says what matters is how we treat others during our bad days." The simple wisdom of her words seemed to penetrate Richard's defensive armor. He looked down at the perfectly prepared espresso, then back at Emma's earnest face. He began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find appropriate words. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I apologize." The apology, though stiffly delivered, broke some of the tension in the air. Emma nodded her acceptance, the relief evident in her shoulders as they relaxed slightly. Meryl observed the exchange with quiet approval. "That's a start," she said. Then, addressing the cafe at large, "It's easy to stand by and watch when someone is being mistreated. I've been guilty of it myself, but every time we stay silent, we become part of the problem." Her words seemed to touch something in several customers who glanced at one another with a mixture of guilt and recognition. A young woman at a corner table spoke up, her voice slightly shaky. "I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say. Sometimes just, 'That's not okay' is enough," Meryl replied. "It breaks the spell of silence." Richard took a sip of his espresso, his expression difficult to read. The reality of being scolded by Meryl Streep in front of a cafe full of onlookers, likely soon to be shared on social media, was sinking in, along with the public nature of his behavior. Jane, sensing a moment of opportunity, addressed everyone. "At Pages and Brews, we believe in creating a space where everyone feels valued, our staff and our customers. That's the community we're trying to build here." The words hung in the air like a gentle challenge, an invitation to contribute to something better than what had just transpired. As if in response, a spontaneous smattering of applause broke out from several tables. Emma's eyes widened at the unexpected support, a genuine smile finally replacing her earlier distress. And in that moment, the confrontation began to transform into something else entirely, a chance for connection, for learning, for the kind of human growth that sometimes happens in the most unexpected places. The moment hung in the air. Richard, with his espresso, Emma behind the counter, and Meryl Streep standing between them like a bridge connecting two different worlds. The famous actress hadn't raised her voice once, yet her presence commanded the entire cafe. "May I join you for a moment?" Meryl asked Richard, gesturing to a nearby empty table. Her tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. Richard hesitated, glancing at his watch. "I really should get going." "5 minutes," Meryl said firmly. "I think we owe each other that much after what just happened here." The cafe watched as Richard reluctantly nodded, following Meryl to the small table by the window. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air between them, a visible tension that neither could ignore. Emma watched. From behind the counter, her hand still on the espresso machine, Jane gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Are you okay? Do you need to take a break?" Emma shook her head, her eyes fixed on Meryl and Richard. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "I want to see." At the table, Meryl sat with the poise that had made her famous on screen, her back straight, her gaze direct but not unkind. "You know," she began, "I've played characters like you." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "People so focused on their destination that they forget to notice the journey. People who measure success in minutes saved rather than connections made." Meryl's voice remained gentle, despite the weight of her words. "It never ends well for those characters." Richard took a sip of his espresso, buying time to compose himself. "It was just a bad morning. I'm not usually—" "We all have bad mornings," Meryl interrupted. "The question is who we choose to be during them." Around them, the cafe had resumed some semblance of normal activity. Customers spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at the unlikely pair by the window. Several had recognized Meryl by now, and phones were discreetly raised to capture the moment. "Emma has Down syndrome," Meryl continued, her voice lowered but still firm. "That means she processes things differently, but it doesn't mean she deserves less respect. In fact, from what I've observed this morning, she shows more care in her work than many people I've met." Richard set down his cup, a flash of defensiveness crossing his features. I never said anything about her condition. This wasn't about that. Wasn't it? Meryl challenged gently. Would you have spoken to me that way if I were behind that counter, taking my time with your order? The question landed precisely where Meryl had aimed it. Richard's gaze dropped to the table, unable to maintain eye contact. The answer was obvious to both of them. Back at the counter, Emma had begun serving other customers with renewed confidence. Each interaction seemed to strengthen her, the earlier trembling replaced by careful, deliberate movements. Several patrons offered her encouraging smiles or kind words, a small tide of support rising in the wake of the confrontation. Get through my day. Most villains don't see themselves that way, Meryl replied with the hint of a smile. That's what makes my job as an actress so interesting, finding the humanity in everyone, even those who make choices I wouldn't make. She leaned forward slightly. But this isn't a film. That young woman is real. The pain on her face when you spoke to her was real, and your chance to do better is real too. As they spoke, a young man approached their table, clutching a worn paperback book. He cleared his throat nervously. Miss Streep, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you. My sister has Down syndrome and... His voice caught slightly. Well, I wish someone had stood up for her like that when she needed it. Meryl reached out, touching his arm gently. What's your name? David, he replied. David, sometimes the person who stands up can be you, she said warmly. You don't need to be famous for your voice to matter. David nodded, eyes bright with emotion, before returning to his table. The brief interaction wasn't lost on Richard, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Do you see? Meryl asked, turning back to him. This moment is bigger than just a coffee order. It's about the kind of world we create with our daily choices. The cafe had transformed in the span of 15 minutes. What had begun as a typical morning had become something extraordinary, not because of celebrity, but because of genuine human connection. Customers who had been strangers were now engaged, in conversation, sharing stories, acknowledging each other with newfound awareness. Emma, watching from behind the counter, felt something she hadn't experienced before in a public setting. Belonging. Not just tolerance or pity, but true acceptance. She caught Meryl's eye across the room, and the actress gave her a subtle nod of acknowledgement, one professional to another. Richard drained the last of his espresso and set the cup down with finality. I should go, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. I have a lot to think about. Before you do, Meryl said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small notebook and pen. Would you write something for Emma? Richard looked startled. What do you mean? A note. An apology. Something she can keep. Meryl pushed the notebook toward him. Words matter, Richard. They can wound, but they can also heal. For a moment it seemed Richard might refuse. His fingers drummed once on the table edge. His jaw tightened. Then, with a slight nod, he took the pen and began to write. Jane approached their table, coffee pot in hand. Refill? She offered, her eyes conveying deeper gratitude than her casual tone suggested. Please, Meryl responded with a warm smile. She watched as Richard continued writing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Whatever internal struggle he was experiencing played out in the pressure of his pen against paper, in the careful selection of each word. When he finally set the pen down and slid the notebook back across the table, Meryl didn't immediately read what he'd written. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes. Thank you, she said simply. It takes courage to acknowledge when we've fallen short. Richard stood, smoothing his tie in a gesture that seemed more habit than necessity. I need to get to my meeting, he said, but he made no move to leave. One more thing, Meryl said, also rising from her chair. Would you come with me to speak to Emma, just for a moment? The request hung between them, a challenge, an opportunity, a chance for immediate redemption. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath. Richard stood frozen, caught between pride and the undeniable pull of doing what was right. The cafe's hushed atmosphere intensified the weight of his decision. After what felt like an eternity, but was merely seconds, he gave a slight nod. All right. Together they walked back to the counter, where Emma was carefully arranging muffins on a display tray. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening slightly. Behind her, Jane positioned herself protectively, ready to intervene if necessary. "Emma," Meryl said warmly, "Richard has something he'd like to say to you." All eyes in the cafe turned toward them. Someone's chair scraped against the floor as they shifted for a better view. The subtle clicks of phone cameras captured the moment from various angles. Richard cleared his throat, his usual boardroom confidence nowhere to be found. "Emma, I want to apologize for how I spoke to you earlier." It was. He paused, searching for the right words. Completely unacceptable. Emma's expression remained cautious, her hands stilling on the muffin tray. After a moment of silence, she responded with unexpected clarity. "It made me feel very small." The simple honesty of her statement seemed to cut through Richard's remaining defenses. His shoulders sagged slightly as the full impact of his behavior registered. "I know," he said quietly, "and that was wrong of me. No one deserves to feel that way, especially when they're just trying to do their job well." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the counter. "I run a marketing firm downtown. We could use someone with your attention to detail in our mailroom. If you're ever interested in additional work, please call me." He slid the notebook Meryl had given him across the counter. "And I wrote something for you. You can read it later." Emma glanced at Jane, who gave an encouraging nod before accepting both the card and the notebook. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now. Meryl watched the exchange with quiet approval. What had begun as an ugly confrontation was transforming into something neither party could have anticipated, a moment of genuine human connection across profound differences. The cafe had grown unusually quiet, everyone witnessing the unexpected resolution. Then David, the young man who had approached Meryl earlier, began to applaud softly. Others joined in, the gentle sound spreading through the space like ripples in still water. Richard's face flushed slightly at the attention, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he reached for his wallet and turned to Jane. "I'd like to pay for everyone's drinks this morning." A collective murmur of surprise rose from the customers. Jane raised an eyebrow but nodded, accepting his credit card. "That's generous," Meryl observed, "but the real gift you've given today is your willingness to change." As Jane processed the payment, Emma carefully opened the notebook, reading Richard's words to herself. Whatever he had written caused her to look up at him with new understanding in her eyes. "My brother has autism," Richard said quietly, so only Meryl and Emma could hear. "I should know better than to judge someone based on how quickly they work. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way." The revelation hung in the air between them, not an excuse for his behavior, but a glimpse into the complex humanity behind his earlier cruelty. Meryl nodded, recognizing the courage it took to share that vulnerability. "We all carry things we don't show the world," she said softly. "The question is whether we let those things make us more compassionate or more closed off." By now, word had spread beyond the cafe's walls. A small crowd had gathered outside, peering through the windows at the famous actress in their neighborhood coffee shop. A local news van pulled up, a reporter and cameraman hurrying toward the entrance. Jane noticed and quickly approached Meryl. "Miss Streep, there's press outside. Would you like to use our back exit?" Meryl considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, but thank you. I think there's an opportunity here." She turned to Emma. "Would you be comfortable if I spoke about what happened today? About the importance of treating everyone with dignity?" Emma's eyes widened. "You want to talk about me?" "About all of us," Meryl clarified. "About what happens when we choose kindness over convenience, understanding over judgment." Emma glanced at Jane, who gave her an encouraging smile, before nodding. "Yes, that would be okay." Richard checked his watch, the gesture now seeming more habitual than impatient. "I really do need to go," he said. "I'm chairing a meeting in 20 minutes. "Of course," Meryl replied. Then, with characteristic directness, "But I hope you'll consider what happened here today as important as whatever is waiting for you at that meeting." Richard held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I already do." He turned to Emma one last time. "Thank you for the excellent espresso. It was worth the wait." With that, he made his way to the door, pausing briefly as he noticed the gathering, crowd and press outside. His posture straightened as if preparing for scrutiny, but he moved forward without hesitation. As the door closed behind him, Meryl turned to Emma. "How are you feeling now?" Emma considered the question carefully. "Different," she finally said, "like maybe it was good that he was angry, because then everyone could see." She struggled to find the words. "That it's not okay to be mean, even when you're important and busy." The wisdom in her observation struck Meryl, who smiled warmly. "That's exactly right. Sometimes difficult moments reveal important truths." The bell above the door chimed as the reporter entered, microphone in hand, cameraman close behind. Jane stepped forward protectively. "We need to respect our customers' privacy," she began. Meryl touched Jane's arm gently. "It's all right. There's a story worth telling here." She looked around the cafe at the diverse faces watching them, people who had been strangers an hour ago, but who now shared something meaningful. "But it's not just about me or Emma or that gentleman who left. It's about all of us and the choices we make every day in how we treat each other." The reporter approached cautiously, clearly surprised by the willingness of the notoriously private actress to speak. "Miss Streep, can you tell us what brought you to Pages and Brews this morning?" Meryl smiled, glancing at Emma, who now stood tall, behind the counter, a world away from the trembling young woman of an hour before. "I came for coffee," she said simply, "but I found something much more valuable." The reporter positioned herself beside Meryl, her cameraman adjusting the focus to include Emma behind the counter. The cafe customers watched with interest. This ordinary morning now transformed into something they would remember for years to come. "We're here at Pages and Brews Cafe with Academy Award-winning actress Meryl Streep, who appears to have intervened in what witnesses describe as a confrontation between a customer and an employee," the reporter began, her professional demeanor barely containing her excitement at the unexpected story. Meryl gently redirected the focus. "If we're going to talk about this, I'd like Emma to join us. This is really her story more than mine." Jane nodded encouragingly to Emma, who hesitantly stepped out from behind the counter. She smoothed her apron nervously as she approached, standing slightly behind Meryl as if seeking shelter in the actress's confident presence. "Emma," Meryl said warmly, "would you feel comfortable sharing your perspective on what happened this morning?" The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the young woman who had been at the center of the conflict. Emma took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron before she straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the camera. "A customer was upset because I was being careful with his order," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He said mean things that made me feel bad about myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But then Ms. Streep stood up for me, and it reminded me what my mom always says, that my value isn't about how fast I work, but about who I am." The simple sincerity of her words seemed to touch everyone present. The reporter, momentarily abandoning her practiced persona, asked, "And how do you feel now, Emma?" A smile spread across Emma's face, not the nervous one she had worn earlier, but something genuine and bright. "I feel proud, and I feel like I belong here." Meryl placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "That's what all of us want, isn't it? To be seen for who we are and to know we belong?" The cameraman zoomed in slightly, capturing the genuine connection between the famous actress and the young barista. In that moment, the story transcended local news. It became something universal and deeply human. David, the young man who had spoken earlier about his sister, approached once more. "May I add something?" he asked the reporter, with a nod from Meryl. The reporter turned the microphone toward him. "What we witnessed today wasn't just about one person being rude," David said. "It was about how we all sat here silently while it happened. Until Ms. Streep spoke up, we were all complicit." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the cafe. Several customers looked down, recognition of their own inaction evident in their expressions. "That's an important point," Meryl added. "It doesn't take fame to speak up when something is wrong. It just takes courage, the willingness to risk a moment of discomfort for the sake of someone else's dignity." As the interview continued, Marco, Emma's co-worker, began passing out freshly baked cookies to the customers. The atmosphere in the cafe had transformed completely, from the tense, uncomfortable space it had been an hour ago to something warm and communal. Outside, The crowd had grown, word spreading through the neighborhood that Meryl Streep was not only at their local cafe, but had intervened in a situation that reflected issues many had witnessed but few had addressed. Several people held up phones through the windows, recording snippets that would soon spread across social media. Jane, seeing the growing interest, stepped forward. "I think we should remember that Pages and Brews has always aimed to be a place where everyone feels welcome," she said. "What happened today is a reminder of why that matters, and an opportunity to do better." Emma, growing more confident in the key spotlight, added, "And it's okay to make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." Her generosity of spirit was evident in her words, not minimizing what had happened, but offering a path forward. Meryl nodded approvingly. "Emma, you remind me of something I've learned over my years in film. The most compelling characters and people aren't those who never fail, but those who find their way back to their best selves after failing." A college student who had been quietly observing raised her hand. When the reporter gestured to her, she stood. "I'm studying psychology, and we just discussed the bystander effect in class last week. How people are less likely to help when others are present. Seeing it happen in real life and then seeing how one person breaking that silence changed everything. It's powerful." "It's a reminder that theories aren't just academic," Meryl responded. "They describe real human behaviors that affect real lives." As the interview continued, a text message alert sounded on Jane's phone. She stepped away to check it, her eyes widening as she read the screen. After a moment, she approached Meryl. "And Emma." "That was Richard," she said softly, so only they could hear. "He's authorized a full scholarship fund for employees with developmental differences who want to pursue further education or training. He's naming it after Emma." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "After me? Why?" "He said you reminded him of what matters," Jane explained, her own voice thick with emotion. "He's coming back tomorrow to discuss the details, if you're comfortable with that." The news was a stunning reversal. The man who had begun the morning by berating Emma was now creating opportunities for others like her. It was a transformation so unexpected, so profound, that even Meryl seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The reporter, sensing something significant had occurred, asked, "Is everything all right?" Meryl looked to Emma, silently asking permission to share. When Emma nodded, Meryl explained Richard's gesture, careful to protect his privacy while highlighting the remarkable change it represented. "That," she said as she finished, "is the power of a turning point. One moment of recognition can cascade into something none of us could have anticipated." Emma, still processing the news, spoke with quiet wonder. "My mom always tells me that everything happens for a reason. Maybe the hard part this morning happened so that something good could come from it." Around the cafe, phones captured her words, already being shared across platforms where they would reach far beyond the walls of Pages and Brews. A simple confrontation in a neighborhood cafe was evolving into something that would touch thousands. A reminder that transformation was always possible, that kindness could emerge from cruelty, and that one person's courage could inspire others to find their own. As the interview concluded, Meryl turned to Emma with genuine warmth. "I came here looking for a quiet morning coffee, but I found something much more valuable. A reminder of what courage looks like." Emma blushed slightly, still not entirely comfortable with being the center of attention, yet standing taller than she had just hours before. "I didn't feel very brave earlier," she admitted. "That's the thing about courage," Meryl replied, her voice gentle. "It's not about feeling fearless, it's about continuing despite the fear." The reporter, sensing a natural conclusion to their interview, thanked them both before turning to address the camera with her closing remarks. As the red recording light switched off, the cafe began to settle into a new normal, albeit one transformed by the morning's events. Customers returned to their books and laptops, though conversations now flowed more freely between tables, strangers connected by their shared experience. Jane offered Meryl a quiet corner table away from the windows, where the actress could finally enjoy the coffee she'd originally come for. "Please join me," Meryl said to Emma, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Unless you need to get back to work?" Jane quickly interjected. "Take your break now, Emma. You've more than earned it." With a grateful smile, Emma untied her apron and slid into the seat opposite Meryl Streep, a scenario so unlikely that she wondered briefly if she might be dreaming. Marco brought over 2 fresh coffees and a plate of pastries before discreetly retreating. "I've been thinking about what you said to Richard," Emma began, carefully selecting her words, "about how we treat people in brief interactions revealing who we are. My mom says something similar. That character is what you do when no one important is watching." Meryl smiled. "Your mother sounds very wise." "She is," Emma agreed, pride evident in her voice. "She always told me that having Down syndrome means I might need to work harder at some things, but it also gives me gifts that others don't have." She paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Like seeing people clearly, not just what they show the world, but what they're really feeling." "That's a remarkable gift," Meryl observed. "One many actors spend decades trying to develop." Emma nodded, her expression turning reflective. "I knew Richard was having a bad day before he even spoke. I could see it in how he stood, how tightly he held himself. It doesn't excuse what he did, but understanding helps," Meryl finished for her. "Empathy doesn't require us to accept mistreatment, but it does allow us to see the humanity in everyone, even those who aren't at their best." Outside the cafe, the crowd had begun to disperse, though several people remained, hoping for a glimpse of the famous actress. Inside, phones had largely been put away, patrons respecting the private conversation taking place in the corner. "What was it like?" Emma asked suddenly. "Standing up to someone like that? You didn't seem scared at all." Meryl laughed softly. "Oh, I was nervous. I always am when confronting unkindness. But over the years I've learned that discomfort passes. Regret at staying silent lasts much longer." She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. "In my career, I've had the privilege of telling many different stories, of stepping into lives very different from my own. It's taught me that everyone deserves to have their story treated with dignity, on screen and in life." A comfortable silence settled between them as they both enjoyed their coffee and the momentary respite from the morning's intensity. Through the cafe windows, sunlight shifted as clouds passed overhead, casting patterns across their table. "I should read what he wrote," Emma said finally, reaching for the notebook Richard had left. She opened it carefully, as if it might contain something fragile. Meryl watched as Emma's eyes moved across the page, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise, and finally to something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity. "He apologized again," Emma said softly. "And he wrote about his brother with autism, how watching him struggle with people's impatience made him promise himself he'd never be that person. But somewhere along the way, he became exactly what he hated." She looked up at Meryl. "He said, meeting me reminded him of that promise, and he's grateful." The profound irony wasn't lost on either of them, how the very person Richard had hurt had become the catalyst for his return to his better self. "What will you do about his job offer?" Meryl asked gently. Emma considered the question seriously. "I love it here," she said, glancing around the cafe. "But maybe I could do both, part-time at each place." Her face brightened with possibility. "That way, I could show people in his office that being different isn't bad. It's just different." Meryl nodded, impressed by the young woman's wisdom and generosity of spirit. "I think that would be incredibly valuable, for them and for you." The bell above the door chimed as Jane greeted new customers entering the cafe. Life was continuing, as it always did, but the space felt permanently altered, as if the atoms themselves had rearranged into something more intentional, more connected. "Would you sign something for my mom?" Emma asked shyly, pulling a small notebook from her pocket. "She's your biggest fan. She's watched The Devil Wears Prada at least 20 times." Meryl laughed warmly. "I'd be honored." She took the notebook, pausing before writing. "What's her name?" "Susan," Emma replied. "She raised me by herself after my dad left. She always said we were a perfect team." Meryl wrote a personal note, signing it with a flourish before handing the notebook back. "Please tell Susan she's raised an extraordinary daughter. That's a far greater accomplishment than any film I've ever made." Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She checked it quickly, her face lighting up. "It's my mum. Someone sent her a video of what happened. She's coming here right now." The prospect of meeting the woman who had instilled such remarkable resilience and compassion in Emma clearly delighted Meryl. "Perfect, I'd love to meet her." As they waited, Meryl noticed several customers approaching Jane at the counter, engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation. After a few minutes, Jane made her way to their table. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, "but something unexpected is happening. Several of our regular customers are offering to help establish a safe space training program for local businesses. They want to ensure that what happened this morning doesn't happen elsewhere." She looked at Emma. "And they're hoping you might be willing to help lead it, sharing your perspective." The invitation represented something profound, a transformation from victim to leader, from someone who had been diminished to someone who could elevate others. Emma looked to Meryl as if seeking guidance in this unfamiliar territory. "What do you think?" she asked. Meryl considered her response carefully. "I think when the universe presents an opportunity to turn pain into purpose, it's offering a rare gift." She smiled encouragingly. "But only you can decide if it's the right path for you." Emma took a deep breath, her eyes bright with possibility. "I want to help," she said with quiet determination. "I want to make a difference." Just then the cafe door flew open and a woman rushed in, her eyes scanning frantically until they locked on Emma. Susan Thompson had her daughter's same warm eyes and determined set to her jaw. When she spotted Emma sitting with Meryl Streep, she froze momentarily in disbelief before hurrying toward their table. The story had reached its resolution, but in many ways it was just beginning. Susan Thompson rushed to her daughter, enveloping Emma in a tight embrace that spoke volumes of love and protection. When they finally separated, Susan's eyes were damp with emotion. "I saw the video," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, a new confidence evident in her posture. "I am now, Mom, really." She gestured toward Meryl. "This is Meryl Streep," Susan finished, clearly overwhelmed. "I know exactly who she is." She turned to the actress, extending her hand. "Thank you, what you did for my daughter today. I don't have words big enough." Meryl took Susan's hand warmly between both of hers. "Your daughter did the hard part. She showed tremendous grace under pressure." She smiled at Emma. "Actually, she's been teaching me a thing or two about courage and forgiveness." Susan looked between them, pride mingling with astonishment on her face. "That sounds like my Emma," she said softly. Jane approached with a fresh pot of coffee and another cup for Susan. "Please join us," she offered. "It's not every day we have such a special gathering at Pages and Brews." As Susan settled into a chair, Emma eagerly shared the developments of the past hour, Richard's Scholarship Fund, the community's response, and the proposed Safe Space training program. With each revelation, Susan's expression shifted from protective concern to cautious hope to outright pride. "The thing is, Mom," Emma concluded, fidgeting slightly with her napkin, "they want me to help lead it, to share my perspective and help train other businesses." Susan reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "Emma, you've been teaching people your whole life, teaching them to look beyond first impressions, to value depth over speed, to find joy in small successes." Her voice softened. "If you want to do this, I know you'll be amazing." The cafe had returned to its normal rhythm, though customers still cast occasional glances toward the corner table where an Oscar-winning actress sat with the morning's unexpected heroes. Outside, the first local news van had arrived, a reporter preparing to broadcast from the sidewalk. Meryl checked her watch reluctantly. "I should be going soon. I have a read-through this afternoon for a new project." "Before you go," Jane interjected, "I'd like to show you something." She nodded toward the front window, where Marco was carefully placing a new sign. Written in elegant script were the words, "Everyone belongs here, everyone matters here." "It's our new official policy," Jane explained. "We've always believed it, but after today, we want to make it explicit." Meryl nodded approvingly. "The best. Policies are those that put human dignity at the center." Susan, who had been quietly observing, suddenly straightened in her chair. "I just realized something," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Today is the anniversary of Emma's first job rejection. 3 years ago today, the manager at Grocermart told her they couldn't accommodate someone like her because their customers expected efficiency. Emma looked surprised. "I forgot about that." "I never did," Susan replied. "But look how far you've come from being rejected to being asked to lead a training program for businesses." The symbolism of the timing wasn't lost on anyone at the table. What had begun as an ordinary workday had transformed into a watershed moment, not just for Emma but potentially for the entire community. As they continued talking, a notification sound chimed from several phones simultaneously. Jane pulled out her device, her eyes widening. "The video of what happened this morning just got picked up by a major news network," she announced. "They're calling it A Lesson in Dignity from Meryl Streep." Meryl sighed softly. "I hope they focus on the real story, Emma's resilience and Richard's capacity for change." She turned to Emma. "How do you feel about all this attention?" Emma considered the question seriously. "It feels strange," she admitted. "But if it helps other people like me feel braver, or helps customers be kinder to people who work differently, then it's worth it." Susan squeezed her daughter's hand, pride evident in her expression. "That's my girl." Beyond their table, the cafe continued to buzz with activity. David, who had spoken about his sister with Down syndrome, was now engaged in animated conversation with a group at a nearby table, sharing stories and perspectives. The college psychology student had pulled out a notebook and appeared to be drafting something, perhaps an article or essay about what she had witnessed. Jane's phone rang and she stepped away to answer it. When she returned moments later, her expression was one of astonishment. "That was the owner of the cafe," she said. "The story has reached him in Chicago. He's authorizing me to implement paid training for all staff on inclusive service, and he wants to extend job offers to more people with developmental differences." She looked at Emma with a smile. "He said, and I quote, 'If all our employees had Emma's dedication and attention to detail, we'd be the best cafe chain in the country.'" Emma's face flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Really? Really?" Jane confirmed. "And he's wondering if you'd be willing to help develop the training program, with compensation, of course." The opportunities unfolding before Emma, Richard's job offer, the community training program, and now this, represented a seismic shift in her life's trajectory, all stemming from a moment of adversity that she had weathered with grace. Meryl, observing the joy on Emma's face, spoke quietly. "This is how change happens, not always through grand gestures or policy changes, but through individual moments of truth that ripple outward." Susan nodded, her eyes glistening. "When Emma was diagnosed, the doctor told me all the things she might never do. Not once did he mention all the things she would teach others." She looked at her daughter with fierce pride. "But I knew. A mother always knows." Outside, the crowd had grown again as word spread about Meryl's presence. A group of young adults, with various developmental differences, had arrived, some holding handmade signs thanking Emma and Meryl for standing up for inclusion and respect. Meryl rose from her chair, gathering her belongings. "I should go, but I'd like to stay in touch," she said to Emma and Susan. "What you're building here is important, and I'd be honored to support it in any way I can." She wrote her personal assistant's contact information in Susan's notebook, then leaned down to embrace Emma. "Remember," she whispered, "your voice matters. Use it." As Meryl prepared to leave, Emma stood as well. "Miss Streep," she said with newfound confidence, "thank you for seeing me. Not just my Down syndrome, but me." Meryl smiled warmly. "That's not a gift I gave you, Emma. It's one you gave everyone here today." She glanced around the cafe at the transformed space and the connected people within it. Some performances change the actor. The truly special ones change the audience too. With that, she squeezed Emma's hand one last time before making her way toward the door, leaving behind a cafe forever changed by her brief visit and by the courage of a young woman who had found her voice in the face of cruelty. 1 month had passed since the morning that had changed everything at Pages and Brews. The small cafe had become something of a local landmark, with visitors often asking to see Emma's counter when they came in, the sign declaring, "Everyone belongs here. Everyone matters here," had been professionally designed, and now hung prominently near the entrance, illuminated by soft lighting. Emma stood behind the register, her movements confident as she greeted the morning customers. Her schedule had evolved to accommodate her new roles: 3 days at the cafe, 2 days at Richard's marketing firm, where she had indeed taken a part-time position in office administration rather than the mailroom. Richard had recognized her meticulous attention to detail as an asset for client documentation. "Good morning, Professor Chen." Emma smiled at the regular customer approaching the counter. "So your usual today?" "Please, Emma," the woman replied warmly, "and I brought something for you." She pulled a campus newspaper from her bag, folding it open to reveal an article titled "The Ripple Effect: How One Moment of Advocacy Changed Our Community." "My students in social psychology wrote this," Professor Chen explained. They interviewed 15 people who were here that morning, examining how witnessing Meryl Streep's intervention affected their subsequent behavior. Emma accepted the paper with a small nod of thanks, setting it aside to read during her break. The academic attention was just one facet of how the incident had transformed from a personal moment into something larger. Local businesses had been calling regularly to inquire about the inclusion training program that was now in development. "How's the curriculum coming along?" Jane asked, joining Emma behind the counter. "Really well," Emma replied. "Mom's helping me organize my thoughts, and Richard's marketing team is designing materials. We have our first session next week at City Hall." What had begun as a spontaneous community response had evolved into a structured initiative, with Emma at its heart. Her innate ability to explain her experiences, with honesty but without bitterness, had proven powerfully effective in early test sessions. The bell above the door chimed as Susan entered the cafe, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. She waved to her daughter before finding a seat near the window. Emma's lunch break was approaching, and they had taken to sharing meals together. On training development days, as the morning rush slowed, Marco took over the register so Emma could join her mother. She hung up her apron, smoothed her hair, and carried 2 freshly prepared lattes to the window table. "This came for you," Susan said, sliding the package across the table. "Special delivery." Emma examined the New York return address with curiosity, before carefully unwrapping the paper. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with her initials embossed in gold, and a handwritten note on heavy cream stationery. "It's from Meryl," Emma whispered, unfolding the note with reverent fingers. "Dear Emma, I've been following your progress through Jane's updates. What you're building in your community is extraordinary. This notebook is for your training program thoughts. My directors always say the best ideas should be captured in something that feels as special as they are. Remember what I told you about using your voice. It matters." With admiration, Meryl Susan watched her daughter's face illuminate with joy. "She remembered," Emma said softly. "Of course she did," Susan replied. "You're not easy to forget, Emma Thompson." Their lunch was interrupted by an excited Marco approaching their table. "Emma, you need to see this." He held out his phone, showing a social media post from the mayor's office announcing a new citywide initiative. Millfield Includes, a program requiring all businesses with city contracts to complete inclusion training. The final line of the announcement read, "Inspired by the Streep incident at Pages and Brews, this program affirms our commitment that Millfield is a place where everyone belongs." Emma stared at the screen in disbelief. "They named it after her, but it was about me," she said, trying to process the magnitude of the change her experience had sparked. "It's about all of us," Susan corrected gently. "About creating a community where what happened to you that morning becomes unthinkable." As they finished their lunch, a familiar figure appeared at the cafe door. Richard, dressed in a more casual suit than he'd worn that fateful morning, scanned the room until he spotted Emma. The transformation in him over the past month had been as remarkable as the changes in the community. Gone was the rigid, time-obsessed executive who had berated a young barista. In his place was a man who had reconnected with the values that truly mattered to him, values he had nearly lost in the relentless pursuit of success. He approached their table with a warm smile. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Susan replied, gesturing to an empty chair. "Emma was just showing me Meryl's gift." Richard nodded appreciatively at the leather notebook. "Perfect timing, actually. I've just come from a Chamber of Commerce meeting. They want to expand the training program to neighboring towns. He turned to Emma. They're offering funding for you to develop a comprehensive curriculum. Full-time position if you want it. Emma's eyes widened. Me, but I've never... Neither had I, Richard interrupted gently, until you reminded me of what matters. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. The proposal's all here. Take your time to think about it. The offer represented yet another unexpected door opening, from being humiliated at her job to being offered a position creating systemic change. The symmetry wasn't lost on Emma. I wouldn't have to leave the cafe completely, would I? She asked, glancing toward the counter that had been the site of both her greatest professional pain and the beginning of her transformation. We could arrange something, Richard assured her. Maybe one day a week to stay connected. Jane, who had been observing from a distance, approached their table. Emma belongs here, she said firmly, but she also belongs wherever she can make the biggest difference. She smiled at her employee, now also her friend. We'll always keep your apron ready. Outside the cafe windows, Millfield continued its daily rhythm. People hurrying to appointments, students with backpacks, parents with strollers. But subtle changes were visible to those who knew where to look. The new accessibility ramp at the bookstore across the street, the inclusive hiring poster in the bakery window, the "Everyone Welcome" signs appearing in storefronts throughout the block. Emma looked out at her transformed community, then down at Meryl's gift, a notebook waiting to be filled with ideas that might transform other communities as well. The path before her wasn't one she could have imagined a month ago, but she now stepped toward it with confidence. I want to do it, she said, looking up at Richard and Jane. I want to help make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Susan reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand with pride. You always said you wanted a job that makes a difference. Emma smiled, running her fingers over the embossed initials on her new notebook. I guess sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important work. The cafe hummed with afternoon activity, customers coming and going in the familiar rhythm that had once been Emma's entire professional world. Now that world was expanding in ways none of them could have predicted, all because a famous actress had happened to witness a moment of cruelty and had chosen not to look away. 6 months after that fateful morning, Pages and Brews was hosting a special event. The normally cozy cafe had been transformed, with extra chairs arranged in rows and a small podium positioned near the front window. A banner hung above the counter reading, Millfield includes 6-month celebration. Emma stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with the confident poise of someone who had found her purpose. She wore a professional blazer over her Pages and Brews t-shirt, a perfect visual representation of how her two worlds had merged. Welcome, Mayor Jensen, she smiled, shaking hands with the city official. Thank you for coming. I wouldn't miss it, Emma, the mayor replied warmly. Your program has become a model for the entire county. What had begun as a response to a single incident of cruelty had blossomed into something remarkable. The Millfield Includes training program had now certified over 100 local businesses, with another 50 in progress. Emma's curriculum, developed with input from various disability advocates, Richard's marketing expertise, and her mother's unwavering support, had gained attention from neighboring cities and even a state legislator. Susan approached, carrying a tray of refreshments. The journalist from the Tribune just arrived, she whispered to her daughter, and Richard called to say he's running a few minutes late, but definitely coming. Emma nodded, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. Public speaking had once been unimaginable to her, but today she would address a room full of community leaders, business owners, and media representatives, telling her story not as a victim, but as an architect of change. Jane moved among the gathering crowd, ensuring everyone had seats. The cafe staff all wore special t-shirts for the occasion, with the now famous phrase, "Everyone belongs here," printed on the back. Marco had even created special cookies decorated with the program's logo. As the clock approached 4 p.m., Richard slipped through the door, slightly breathless. Traffic, he explained apologetically to Emma. Did I miss anything? Just about to start, she assured him. The transformation in Richard remained one of the most powerful aspects of the entire story, from the man who had beratingly publicly for working too slowly to becoming one of her most dedicated advocates. His marketing firm now proudly employed 3 people with developmental differences, and he frequently spoke about how this had improved both the workplace culture and client satisfaction. The mayor stepped to the podium, calling for attention. 6 months ago, an unfortunate incident in this very cafe sparked something unexpected, a community-wide conversation about inclusion, dignity, and belonging. She gestured toward Emma. Thanks to the courage of Emma Thompson and the support of many others, that conversation has transformed into action. Applause filled the cafe as Emma made her way to the front. On the wall behind her hung framed newspaper articles chronicling the journey, from the initial viral moment with Meryl Streep to the launch of the training program, to testimonials from local businesses about its impact. Thank you all for coming, Emma began, her voice clear and steady. 6 months ago, I was just trying to make coffee and do my job well. Today I'm still making coffee sometimes. She smiled at Jane. But I'm also helping create a community where everyone can contribute in their own way, at their own pace. As she spoke, Emma's natural gift for heartfelt communication shone through. She didn't use complex terminology or academic language. Instead, she shared simple truths about human dignity that resonated with everyone present. When someone treats you like you don't belong, she continued, it hurts in a place words can't reach. But when a community says, you matter here, it heals something just as deep. The room listened in respectful silence, many nodding in recognition of the universal truth in her words. Among the audience, David sat with his sister, the young woman with Down syndrome he had mentioned to Meryl Streep that day. She now worked at the local library, another business that had completed Emma's training program. After Emma's speech, Richard took the podium to present the program's impact statistics. 112 businesses certified, representing over 60% of Millfield's commercial district, he announced proudly. Employment of people, with various abilities up 28% across participating businesses. The numbers were impressive, but the real story was in the human connections that had formed, the community that had discovered its better self through an unexpected catalyst. As the formal presentation concluded, the gathering shifted to a more casual reception. Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, including several business owners who shared stories of how the training had transformed their workplaces. The accessibility changes we made for physical disabilities ended up helping our elderly customers too, the hardware store owner told her. Our business is actually up 15% since we got certified. A notification chimed on Emma's phone, a message that made her smile brightly. She quickly found Susan and Richard, showing them the screen. Meryl sent a video message for today, she explained excitedly. Her assistant says we can play it for everyone. Within minutes, Jane had connected a laptop to the cafe's TV screen, and the room quieted as Meryl Streep's face appeared. Though she was clearly on a film set somewhere, she had taken the time to record a special message. Hello, Millfield, she began warmly. I wish I could be with you today to celebrate what you've accomplished. What began as a single moment of standing up for human dignity has grown into something that's changing lives daily. Her eyes seemed to find Emma through the screen. Remember that morning when I told you your voice matters? You've proven just how powerful that voice can be. I'm honored to have played a small role in your story, but make no mistake. This legacy belongs to you, Emma, and to everyone in Millfield who chose to build something better together. As the video ended, spontaneous applause filled the cafe. Emma wiped away a tear, overwhelmed by how far they had come. The mayor approached, handing Emma an official-looking envelope. The City Council voted unanimously last night. Starting next month, Millfield Includes will become a permanent city. Department with full funding, she smiled warmly. And we'd like you to lead it, Emma, if you're willing. The moment was beyond anything Emma could have imagined when she had struggled to scan grocery items 6 months earlier, trembling under the weight of a stranger's cruelty. Now that same stranger stood nearby, proudly applauding her success. Meryl Streep's brief intervention had revealed possibilities none of them had seen before. Susan put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I always told you that you would change the world in your own special way," she whispered. Emma looked around the cafe, at the faces of people who had become not just supporters, but friends, at the community that had transformed itself by choosing to see everyone's value. The legacy of that difficult morning wasn't just a training program or even a city department. It was the profound realization that a single voice, raised at the right moment for the right reason, could echo far beyond. Its origin. "Everyone belongs here," Emma said softly, repeating the words that had become both her mantra and her mission. "Everyone matters here." And in Millfield, at least, those words were finally becoming true. If you enjoyed this story, we have many, more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.